It was supposed to be a joke, a harmless throwaway line that Johnny Carson would forget 5 seconds after he said it. But instead it triggered one of the most emotionally devastating moments in Tonight Show history. A moment so raw that NBC executives quietly removed it from reruns for years, because on that night Johnny casually told Dean Martin to play a harmonica just for fun, never realizing that the song Dean would choose was tied to a buried warm memory, a dead friend, and a promise. Neither man had spoken out loud in more than 2 decades, and within minutes, the king of late night would be openly sobbing on his own stage. The night began like hundreds of others before it, smooth, polished, effortless, the kind of Tonight Show episode Johnny could practically run on muscle memory alone. It was early 1967. Studio One at NBC Burbank was filled with 300 people buzzing with laughter and anticipation. Doc Severinsen's band was sharp, Ed McMahon was locked in, and Johnny, perfect suit, perfect timing, perfect smile, was exactly who America expected him to be. Dean Martin was the guest everyone loved most, not because he tried, but because he didn't. He slouched into fame, made charm look accidental, and traded barbs with Johnny in a way no other guest ever could. Their chemistry was legendary. 2 men who hid behind humor so well that no one ever questioned what they were hiding from. Dean had already done his usual routine that night. The mock tipsy grin, the loose tie, the offhand insults that somehow landed like compliments. The audience laughed easily, comfortably, secure in the promise that nothing unexpected would happen. Johnny leaned back behind his desk, shuffling his cards more out of habit than necessity, when he noticed a lull. Just a few seconds where the laughter faded and the moment hung there, unclaimed. Johnny hated dead air, so he did what he always did. He filled it. "Dean," he said with a smirk, leaning toward the microphone. "You ever play the harmonica?" The audience chuckled. It sounded like the setup to a bit, the kind of nonsense question that would end in a punchline and a rim shot. Dean lifted an eyebrow, tilted his head, and shrugged. "I mess around," he said. Johnny waved his hand dismissively, playing it up. "Come on," he said. "Give us a little solo. Just for fun." It was meant to be nothing, filler before the commercial, a laugh Johnny could toss away without a second thought. But something changed. Dean didn't reach for a joke. He didn't grin. He didn't glance at the band. Instead, he went still, the way a man does when he's suddenly somewhere else. The audience felt it before they understood it. The laughter tapered off, confused. Dean nodded once, slowly. "Yeah," he said, quieter now. "I can do that." Johnny noticed the shift immediately. He'd been reading people for a living for decades, and something in Dean's voice didn't belong to television. But before Johnny could pivot, before he could pull it back into safe territory, Dean reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small harmonica. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't new. It looked worn, dented, personal. The kind of object you don't carry unless it means something. A few people in the front row leaned forward. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet. Ed McMahon stopped smiling. Johnny opened his mouth to say something. Anything. To steer this back toward comedy. But Dean was already lifting the harmonica to his lips. The studio fell into an unfamiliar silence, the kind that makes producers nervous and audiences unsure whether they're allowed to breathe. And then Dean Martin played. Not fast, not flashy, just a slow, aching melody that drifted across the room like a memory refusing to stay buried. It didn't sound like entertainment. It sounded like a confession. Johnny's smile froze, then vanished. His hands tightened around his cards. Because he knew that song. He hadn't heard it in years, decades, really, but his body recognized it before his mind. Caught up. It was a Korean War barracks tune, something soldiers passed between units late at night when letters from home didn't come and the cold wouldn't let you sleep. Johnny felt the studio dissolve around him. He wasn't behind the desk anymore. He was 26 again, overseas, listening to the same melody echo through a dark room while a young man from Ohio named Eddie Fisher played harmonica beside him, promising it would all be over soon. Johnny swallowed hard. Dean's eyes were closed now. His hands trembled as he played, not with age, but with effort, like every note cost him something. Halfway through, Johnny felt his chest tighten. His breathing changed. He didn't understand yet why his vision was blurring. Only that something he had spent his entire adult life keeping locked away had just been invited onto national television. The song ended softly, no flourish, No joke at the end to release the tension. Dean lowered the harmonica. No one clapped. No one moved. Johnny stared at his desk, fighting for composure, his instincts screaming to make a joke, to reset the room, to be Johnny Carson again. Well, he said finally, voice unsteady. I asked for fun, not. He stopped. The word wouldn't come. His eyes filled despite himself. Dean looked at him then, not as a performer, not as a Rat Pack legend, but as a man who knew exactly where Johnny had just been taken. Johnny, Dean said softly. I haven't played that since Korea. The words hit Johnny like a physical blow. The audience gasped. Ed McMahon stood up slightly from his chair, unsure what to do. Johnny's hand came up to his face, and for the first time in Tonight Show history, the host broke down on camera. Not from exhaustion, not from pressure, but because a song he never asked to hear had dragged a forgotten war, a dead friend, and a lifetime of silence straight into the lights, and nothing in his decades of television mastery had prepared him for what came next. The silence after Dean Martin lowered the harmonica was not the kind that belonged on television. It was heavy, intrusive, the kind that made producers shift in their seats and audiences wonder if something had gone terribly wrong, because Johnny Carson, the man who could rescue any moment with a joke, was staring down at his desk like it had betrayed him. He tried to smile again, tried to recover the rhythm of the show, but his face wouldn't cooperate. His hands were shaking now, just slightly, enough that Ed McMahon noticed and leaned forward instinctively, ready to bail him out if needed. Johnny cleared his throat. That's quite something, Dean, he said, but his voice cracked on the last word, betraying him in a way millions of viewers had never seen before. The audience shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to applaud, unsure whether they were witnessing something private that wasn't meant for them. Dean sat quietly, harmonica resting in his palm like an old wound he'd just reopened, his usual swagger completely gone. I didn't mean to, Dean said gently, not joking now, not performing. When you asked, that was the one that came out. Johnny nodded, eyes still downcast, and for a long moment he didn't speak at all. In the control room, producers exchanged panicked looks. This wasn't planned. This wasn't safe. This wasn't comedy. But the cameras kept rolling because no one had the courage to cut away. Johnny finally looked up, his eyes glossy, his composure hanging by a thread. There was a kid, he said slowly, choosing each word like it might explode if handled wrong. His name was Eddie. He played that same song. Same way. Every night. The studio froze. Johnny Carson never talked like this. Never referenced himself outside the polished persona. Dean nodded once, his jaw tightening. Eddie Fisher, he said quietly. The name landed like a dropped plate. Johnny inhaled sharply. Yeah, he whispered. You knew him. Dean exhaled, a long breath he'd clearly been holding for years. I held him, Dean said. After the Jeep rolled. He kept asking me to play it again. Said it helped him breathe. Johnny's face crumpled. He turned away from the camera, but there was nowhere to hide. The audience could see his shoulders shaking now. The man who had built a career on control losing it completely. Ed McMahon stood up, placed a hand on Johnny's back, but Johnny waved him off, needing to finish whatever had started. I promised him, Johnny said, voice breaking, that I'd remember the song. I promised I wouldn't forget. He laughed weakly, a sound full of disbelief. And I did forget. For a long time. Dean leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on Johnny. You didn't forget, he said. You just survived. That was when Johnny finally broke. He covered his face, shoulders shaking openly now, and the audience followed him. Sniffles, quiet sobs, people clutching their chests as they realized they weren't watching a show anymore. They were watching two men confront a ghost neither of them had ever spoken about out loud. The band sat motionless. No music cue came. No commercial break saved them. Johnny wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and forced himself upright, breathing hard. I'm sorry, he said to the audience, embarrassed and sincere at the same time. This wasn't supposed to happen. Dean shook his head. Maybe it was, he said. Johnny looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time that night, there was gratitude there instead of shock. How long have you carried that thing? Johnny asked, nodding at the harmonica. Dean glanced down at it. Since the war, he said. Never played it again. Thought if I didn't, the memory would stay quiet. He paused. Turns out memories don't need permission. Johnny gave a wet, broken laugh. No, he said. They sure don't. He took a breath, steadied himself, and then did something no one expected. He stood up from behind the desk and walked around it, closing the distance between them. The audience rose slightly in their seats, sensing the weight of the moment. Johnny held out his hand, not for a joke, not for showmanship, but for connection. Dean stood and took it, gripping Johnny's forearm the way soldiers do, firm and deliberate. They stood there for a few seconds longer than television etiquette allowed, two men silently acknowledging a shared past that fame had never erased. When they finally sat back down, Johnny looked into the camera, eyes still red. "We're going to take a break," he said softly. "And when we come back, we'll figure out how to keep going." The band played quietly as the show faded to commercial. But backstage, crew members would later say Johnny stayed seated long after the lights dimmed, staring at that harmonica like it had unlocked a room he'd spent his life pretending didn't exist. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to close the door again. When the show returned from commercial, nothing looked different, but everything was. Johnny sat behind the desk again, posture straight, cue cards neatly stacked, the familiar picture of control restored just enough to function. Yet something essential had shifted beneath the surface. The audience sensed it immediately. The laughter came slower now, more careful, as if no one wanted to break what had just been revealed. Dean Martin sat beside him, harmonica gone, hands folded, quieter than anyone had ever seen him on that stage. Johnny took a breath and addressed the camera, his voice steady but softer than usual. "You know," he said, "we spend a lot of time on this show trying to make things look easy, funny, light." He paused, choosing his words. "But sometimes life doesn't give you that option." Dean glanced at him and nodded. "That song," Johnny continued, "came from a time most of us don't talk about. A time when a lot of good people didn't come home." He didn't say Korea. He didn't need to. The weight of it was already in the room. Johnny turned to Dean. "Thank you," he said simply. Dean shrugged, the smallest hint of his old smile returning, but it didn't quite land. "He deserved to be remembered," Dean replied. Johnny nodded. "Yeah," he said. He did. The audience finally applauded. Not loudly, not exuberantly, but with the kind of respect usually reserved for funerals and homecomings. When the segment ended, Johnny stood and shook Dean's hand again, this time holding on just a second longer than the cameras required. Off-air, the crew would later say that neither man spoke much as they walked backstage, that Johnny placed a hand on Dean's shoulder before heading to his dressing room. Eyes still red, expression unreadable. NBC never promoted the episode. The harmonica moment was quietly trimmed from reruns. No explanation was ever given. But people who were there remembered it as the night The Tonight Show stopped being a performance and became something else entirely. A reminder that even the most polished smiles are built on lives lived long before the spotlight, and that sometimes the smallest request, made as a joke, can unlock a truth powerful enough to bring the strongest man in the room to tears.